So tonight, I'm pretty much just going to be talking about wages and profits. And really what I'm starting with is this graph, which has been used to advertise tonight's event. And it really, I think, just tells quite an interesting story about Australia's economy, and one that perhaps is a bit more nuanced than it might seem on the surface. But I think when you dig underneath it, you really can sort of see what's going on and what's going wrong in Australia's economy, and certainly what's going wrong from my point of view in terms of wages. It was interesting, and Fernanda in the introduction there noting that in 2018, I was a finalist for the Walkley Awards in the category of industrial relations for a series of articles Gareth Hutchins and I did on the wage crisis. And the fact that it's 4 years' time and we're still talking about it just shows how endemic it really is. Now, this graph, it's an odd sort of a graph because it was actually a reject of mine. I was writing, doing an article on the latest GDP figures a few weeks back. And I'd done this and it looked good, but I couldn't think where to put it in the article, and it didn't really fit with what I was actually talking about, which was mostly GDP, sort of trying to explain to readers what was going on, but I kind of liked it. So instead of putting it in the article, I just decided to tweet it and sort of say, here's the graph that didn't make it in my article tomorrow. And it kind of went mad. And I very quickly realized I'd made a bad call in leaving it out of the article, because it was one of the more sort of popular graphs that I'd ever tweeted. Sally McManus, the secretary of the ACTU, absolutely fell in love with it, tweeting it almost daily. I was sort of joking that I really should have sold it to her as an NFT, and then I'd be really doing well. But it's one of those things where it really sort of cut through, because like most good graphs that if I ever come up with a good graph, it's something that you can look at and you almost don't even need to understand what the hell is going on. You don't need to know what an index is or how it's all calculated. You can just look at it and know there's a story there, and someone's doing a hell of a lot better off than someone else is doing. And when you look at it and you see its profits and wages, it kind of just really hits home. Now, it hit home also for business groups who absolutely hated it. And were letting the ACTU know they hated it, and with lots of pushback. One of the things they could never push back on it was the actual economics of it, or the numbers there. They mightn't have liked the story that was being told, but they couldn't fault what was being told. So we had the pushback. The Financial Review got on board and interviewed the BCA and ACCI and all other range of groups, and who were suggesting that it was a simplistic us versus them narrative based on a simplistic view of what workers' falling share of income, and it all going to profits. When that article came out, I thought, I'm just going to push back myself a little bit, and so I tweeted. Put this out tweeting that you might be shocked to discover that employer groups really hate seeing that graph. And that truly has become one of my sort of more viral kind of tweets. As of this morning, it's been seen by 372,200 people, which kind of just as a side issue goes to the fact that social media can be pretty powerful at getting a message out, especially when it's one that people feel that they know, but they can't articulate it, and they're looking for some proof, some actual evidence of what's going on in the economy. Now, I just want to go back to this graph. It's essentially just a graph of, it's not actually from the quote unquote traditional GDP figures. It's from what's called the business indicator figures. It's a graph of gross operating company profits and wages in all industries except for education and health and care, and social care, because of course they're essentially non-profit industries, so they don't have any profits. So I decided, in the interest of fairness, not to include them in the wages as well, because that would, be comparing apples with oranges. Now, the big pushback from business groups and from people certainly on social media to me is that, oh, well, of course it looks bad because it's including the mining industry. To which I respond, absolutely. Of course it includes the mining industry, because the mining industry is a massive part of Australia's economy. And it's always struck me as a little bit weird that we should stop including the mining industry in our analysis of the economy, because we were certainly happy, or certainly business groups and conservative sides of politics were certainly happy to talk about the mining industry during the mining boom of the early 2000s. And even during the GFC, where there was a suggestion that the mining boom saved Australia rather than perhaps any stimulus measures or fiscal efforts by the then Rudd government. And the fact that the story is perhaps not how they'd like it doesn't mean, I think, that we can dismiss the mining industry and just not include it. Because what we've seen is certainly over the past 20 years, if you look in that during that mining boom, certainly there was an increase in profits ahead of wages. And a lot of that was even then driven by the mining sector. But it was nowhere near the extent that we've seen since 2016. And the main reason being that since 2016, the mining companies are essentially making money hand over fist, because they've stopped building most of the big mines and are now just, exporting out all their minerals and iron ore and coal and so forth. And not really having to employ many people to do that. In fact, they can do a lot of driverless trucks and various things. So that makes it great for profits, not great for the industry actually flowing through, the benefits of that industry flowing through. Now, to those who would suggest that, oh, well, this is a biased graph because it includes the mining industry, and this suggestion that it's us versus them, I kind of like to push back on that, because I'm perfectly happy for the mining sector to make bundles of profits. But I am only happy if they're actually then paying a fair share of tax. And if we were seeing the mining companies, especially in the gas industry, paying a share of tax that is, I would say, consistent with the level of windfall profits that they are receiving due to essentially nothing that they've done, but just world factors, I wouldn't be so perhaps bolshy about using the mining sector in there. But so long as we have a state of affairs where we're becoming one of the major exporters of gas, and yet we're not seeing barely anything even coming through in the petroleum resources rent tax, I'm more than happy to keep including profits from the mining sector in any graph about the wages. But hey, let's be nice. Let's get rid of the mining sector. And we still see, while it's certainly nowhere near as great, there has still been since 2016 an increase in profits, and it was the split had occurred even before the pandemic, and certainly during the pandemic, company profits have exploded rather more than wages have. And it's certainly, it's not a case of we're just, being able to say we can, if we take away the mining sector, that, everything's fair. Certainly, if we look at manufacturing, you can see that basically since 2016, profits in the mining sector are about 80% increased, and yet wages are about 5%. Total wage bill of the manufacturing sector is barely up. So I kind of do always like pushing back when business groups and others sort of suggest, oh, it's all about mining. When I say, well, okay, if it is all about mining, great, let's have a windfall profits tax to take advantage of that, what clearly is an exceptional increase in profits. But actually, if we look a bit deeper, it's not just mining. And if we think about that period sort of since 2016, if you look across all industries, since March 2016, which if you go back to that first graph is when the profits and wages really go in separate directions, you can see in that time, every single industry, there have been a greater growth of profits than there has been wages, except for the arts and recreation sector and the accommodation and food services sector. And clearly the reason for that is because they are the two sectors that were absolutely smashed by the pandemic, where you had, an inability to host events and theatres and so forth. And also obviously the accommodation we know has been absolutely destroyed. So, it's not a graph, I think, that hides things because it includes the mining industry. It might exaggerate it, but sometimes you need to exaggerate things for effect. And I think even in doing so, I'm quite happy to defend that graph, to defend the numbers, because it is clear the profits have been growing ahead of wages. Now, I just want to quickly sort of talk about wages growth and what drives it. The two things are basically inflation and productivity. We want inflation, wages to keep pace with inflation so that at least our standard of living can increase. But what we know, and this is going up to the March figures, I haven't included the latest June inflation figures because we haven't got the latest June wages figures. But what you can see is pretty clear that back in 2009, when we had inflation at reaching a high around 5%, which is where it was in May, wages were growing a lot faster than they are now. There's certainly been a decrease in wages, and there's been a very little response to inflation. So I think there's a problem there in the fact that wages aren't keeping up with inflation. And yet it's amazing how during this last election campaign, there was a constant suggestion that wages growing faster than inflation is a bad thing, especially if it was to do with the minimum wage. And it was something that I've found quite surprisingly that we've had to push back on from the Institute and the Centre for Future Work, this belief that, if wages grow faster than inflation, that somehow that's bad for the economy, where it's actually just what should be a natural state of things if we want standard of living to improve. But clearly the thing that will make standard of living improve is not just inflation. We need to have something that enables us to go faster than that, and it's productivity. What we're seeing at the moment, however, is as we can see from the previous graph with wages and inflation, real wages have plummeted in the past. And so something is clearly gone wrong. We shouldn't be losing 10 years of real wages growth. And what we are seeing is that not only are wages not keeping up with inflation, they're not even keeping up with productivity. And I have two graphs here that look at the growth of real wages and productivity. Productivity is a bugger of a thing to measure, and actually so is real wages in the economy. You can use the wages price index. It's a nice, easy one, but there are some wonky economical things that I won't go into. So what you've got there on the left is using the wages price index, a fairly standard sort of wages measure. And the one on the right is a bit more detailed one where I'm digging into the national accounts and things to come up with a bit more long-term figure as well. But it really doesn't matter what figures you're using. Productivity is growing faster than real wages, and that's not how the economy is supposed to work. Real wages are supposed to grow with productivity. We're seeing today, I was quite surprised perhaps to see the Productivity Commission put out a report suggesting that actually real wages are growing a bit faster than we might say, because inflation is undercounting or something, which I'm kind of old school. I believe that inflation is inflation, and if you have to try and pretend that it's not counting what you think it's counting, that might suggest something more deeper is wrong with your argument than just the figure. But so you can see what we've got here is a case of wages not keeping up with inflation and real wages not keeping up with productivity. And this is a nice little graph I like, of breaking down essentially the government terms of office this century. And you can see that only in that sort of mining boom period of 2004 to 07 did you see wages growth being greater than productivity and inflation together. And as you see, since 2019 and that goes up till March, not only have wages not increased with inflation, they haven't, or productivity, they haven't, even increased with inflation, they're going backwards. So it really is a story, I think, where you're really struggling to argue that actually there's nothing wrong here, that workers and wages are growing as they should. because pretty much everywhere you look, whether it's profits versus wages, whether it's wages share of national income, whether it's wages compared to inflation or compared to real wages compared to productivity or both compared to everything, the story is basically the same. And the problem is this has real impacts, as we've seen, where inflation has absolutely taken hold in the past 12 months, and workers have been the ones who have absolutely been smashed rather than companies. The ABS in its latest GDP figures actually put in a note saying that businesses have done quite well out of rising prices, whereas workers haven't. My colleagues at the Australia Institute making use of some data or a methodology by the European Central Bank had a look at the impact on the GDP inflation, the GDP deflator, and found that overwhelmingly it's been driven by profits. I mean, when you've got profits absolutely surging, as we've seen in those graphs, that has an impact. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone's out there profiteering off of prices, and just raising prices willy-nilly. Obviously, there have been increases in input costs and so forth, but we're not seeing anywhere near the increase in labor costs, in wages, that is driving inflation. So it really is not a case of the 1970s where wages were kind of driving inflation. We had those wage spirals. Here, it's kind of perhaps a profit spiral. And it's something that, business groups really don't like to address. And it flows through to a number of, into wages. When wages aren't growing as fast as they should, when things turn bad, as they have just recently with inflation, you see massive falls in real wages. And that is a huge hole to dig yourself out of. It's very hard to get real wages growing fast. Last week, Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, put out the economic statement, and his suggestion was that real wages are going to start picking up in 22, 23. And they're going to go pick up faster than they actually went during the mining boom, which would be great if it happens. I don't know. But even then, it's not going to be till 2028 are we going to get back to the pre-pandemic levels. If it's the mining boom pace, it's later on in 29. If it's the post-GFC trend where we had this sort of decade of blur, we're looking at sort of mid-next decade. But that's only just getting us back to where we were. It's not taking into account where we should have been. And you can see even there, the getting back to that pre-pandemic trend before everything went tits up, basically, takes a hell of a long time. And it's going to, and if we stay on that post-GFC trend, we never get back to the previous trend. What is crucial, and hopefully we can sort of tease out, and I'm sure Anthony will, is that this is not an accident. And if we want to get back to a faster real wage growth, we actually need to look at policies, and we'll tease those out in the discussion, hopefully. Because at the moment, the picture that we've seen, all of that past 20 years of poor real wage growth, it's not an accident. It was something that has been structured into the economy, into the labor market, that prevents wages growing. And even now, with real wages falling faster than they ever have, certainly in my working lifetime, we're already getting calls that we need to keep a tamp on wages growth to stop inflation, even though wages growth has had, bugger all to do with it. So it's a crucial and problem that we're going to be facing certainly in the next 3 years in this government's term. And it's something that we really need to face up to, because pretty much all the chickens have come home to roost, basically, in terms of the way the labor market has been structured. It was nice when everything was going along well, but it's been hit by a massive test from this pandemic and in the recovery, and I kind of think it's failed.